Singapore was not simply defended. It was constructed as a fortress, shaped by a specific understanding of how a war in the region would unfold. The island held strategic importance, and its defenses were built around the expectation that any major threat would arrive from the sea, where control had traditionally been decided by naval power. Along the coastline, heavy artillery was placed in fixed positions, covering the maritime approaches with pre-aimed firepower that could be deployed without delay. These were not temporary installations, but reinforced structures designed to endure, forming a defensive system that projected stability, preparation, and control. The logic behind this design was not improvised. It followed a clear assumption that the decisive engagement would take place at a distance before any opposing force could establish itself on land. Within that framework, preparation did not mean flexibility, but precision, ensuring that every major component was already aligned with the expected direction of attack. The system did not account for alternatives because it was not designed to consider them. What made it strong also made it difficult to change, fixing its attention on a single direction while excluding others from consideration. As a result, it did not depend on movement or rapid adaptation. It did not need to shift or reconfigure itself in real time, because the scenario it was built to confront had already been defined. Every weapon, every position, and every layer of planning pointed outward toward the water, reinforcing a single coherent view of where the threat would emerge. In that sense, the system was not failing. It was functioning exactly as it had been designed to. The problem was not its execution, but its premise, because everything within it had been optimized for a form of attack that, while expected, was never the one that would actually arrive. Within that structure, there was a sense of certainty, not because every possibility had been accounted for, but because every other possibility had effectively been dismissed. The defenses were not incomplete. On the contrary, they were highly developed, but only within the limits of the assumption that shaped them. By the time everything was in place, the fortress did not appear vulnerable. It appeared decisive, ready to respond with force and coordination to an attack that, in its own logic, could only come from the sea. That assumption held as long as the threat came from the sea. The attack did not come from that direction. Instead of advancing across open water, Japanese forces moved south through the Malayan Peninsula, advancing over land toward positions that had not been structured to receive them. Terrain that had been considered secondary, dense, and difficult became the primary path of movement. The system did not respond immediately, not because it had failed, but because nothing within it changed. Positions remained fixed. Observation continued. Communication lines stayed active. Everything remained in place. Everything continued to operate. Everything stayed aligned. There was no visible failure. Nothing appeared wrong, but what it was working against had already shifted. It was happening somewhere else. Movement was no longer developing along the coastline. It was forming inland, outside the direction the system had been built to observe. Positions remained oriented toward the sea, maintaining alignment with an expectation that had not yet been questioned. Nothing stopped. Nothing adapted. The structure held. The system remained active. The framework stayed intact. There was no single moment of collapse, no clear break, only a growing separation between where the system was focused and where the conflict was actually unfolding. Observation remained fixed. Readiness remained in place. Every element continued to function with precision, but within a space that no longer matched the conditions around it. Everything was still working. It simply wasn't working where it needed to. As the advance moved closer, the misalignment became more difficult to ignore, not because the system had weakened, but because its direction had not changed. The fortress had not been breached from the front. It had been approached from a direction it had never considered. What had once been a matter of alignment was no longer a matter of adjustment. The system had not stopped. It had not broken. It had not changed. It remained in place. It remained active. It remained unchanged. Positions were still occupied. Weapons were still ready. Orders continued to move through the same channels. Everything that had defined the system was still there, but the outcome was no longer within it. The distance between where it was focused and where the conflict had moved was no longer theoretical. It was physical. Forces had advanced beyond the limits the system had been built to control, not by overcoming it directly, but by existing outside of it. There was no moment of collapse, no single failure that explained what was happening, only a growing presence in places that had never been meant to hold it. The system did not adapt. It continued. It continued to operate with precision. It continued to follow the same structure. It continued to respond within the same limits. It remained in place. It remained active. It remained unchanged. And it kept going, even as it no longer mattered. The outcome had already moved beyond it. There was no point left to correct. Everything was still functioning. It simply no longer had any effect on the outcome. The system was not overwhelmed. It was bypassed. And once that happened, there was no way to restore what had already been lost. By the time it became visible, it no longer needed to be stopped. The advance begins to lose coherence across Singapore. What once moved forward as a single direction now breaks into separate actions across the city. Streets that appeared open minutes ago are suddenly cut by fire, debris, or vehicles left blocking the way. A truck turns into a side street already under fire. There is no time to correct it. Command structures remain in place, but their effect weakens. Orders are still being given, yet they arrive late or no longer match what units are actually facing. The city itself begins to interfere. Narrow streets, damaged buildings, and limited visibility compress movement. Lines that once felt connected now separate without warning. Vehicles continue advancing, some pushing forward without knowing what lies ahead. Others stop entirely, trapped between rubble and incoming fire, unable to move or turn around. Positions that were meant to hold begin to fail, not always because they are overrun, but because the fight moves around them. Fire comes from directions that were never expected. Soldiers turn, adjust, and react, but each reaction opens another gap somewhere else. Communication begins to break down. Messages arrive incomplete, delayed, or not at all. Units start relying only on what they can see directly in front of them, and what they see changes constantly. Some continue pushing forward out of momentum. Others begin to fall back, not as part of a coordinated withdrawal, but because staying in place is no longer possible. A position is held, then abandoned, then cut off entirely. No one sees the full picture anymore. The system is still there. Orders still exist. Routes are still marked. Positions are still defined, but they no longer connect. And once that connection is lost, the battle changes. It is no longer about advancing. It becomes about holding anything at all, for as long as it can still be held.